Okay, well, before handing over to you, the audience, I just want to do a quick summary and ask a couple of questions to our two excellent speakers. It seems to me that there is actually quite a surprising amount of background agreement once you take into account the pretext for intervention, particularly what David describes as hard intervention. So, for example, if there is genocide impending or obviously about to take place or actually taking place, if a country has degenerated into civil war, if you have your Rwanda or Bosnia or Kosovo, it seems that both sides are broadly of the opinion that some kind of hard intervention is necessary on moral grounds, on overriding moral grounds, really. Equally, I think neither of these two were likely to disagree that some action had to be taken against Osama bin Laden after 9/11, and since he was being sheltered in Afghanistan and had committed an act of obvious aggression, and the international community agreed on it too, there needed to be an attack. So it seems to me that there are fairly easily identifiable preconditions in which actually most of you in this room, and probably both the speakers here, would agree that intervention and hard intervention is probably necessary. Iraq, of course, is the difficulty here, and let's just leave that aside for the moment. What I want to bring in is the interesting question, the different question, the more modern question given events now taking place in North Africa and the Middle East. What's one's attitude to intervention when the evidence of popular uprising is there before you? When Libya is a classic case in point, and Rory, I'm going to put this question to you now. Do all of you who profess to be broadly non-interventionists follow the line that we just let Libya get on with it, and that to do anything else would actually be to create more problems than not? Or do we lobby hard for an international solution, a no-fly zone solution, which itself will require considerable military intervention to knock out Gaddafi's anti-aircraft positions? Or do we take a more David line and say, yeah, they have expressed their strong desire to be free of tyranny and possibly also to have democracy, and we should take every step to aid and abet them? Rory.
Okay, I think, without being boring about it, we need to define our terms. Intervention means something very, very clear. And it comes from the Latin word meaning coming between. When we talk about a military intervention in the modern context, we're talking about putting troops on the ground. We're not talking about imposing sanctions. We're not even talking about no-fly zones. Right? What we did in the Kurdish areas of northern Iraq was not an intervention. Nobody's ever called it an intervention. So what we're talking about is, do we or do we not, to use another Latin word, invade another country? Right? Do we go into Libya because Colonel Gaddafi is strafing his population? Do we deploy NATO or United Nations troops onto the ground? On what grounds? What is the red line which Gaddafi needs to cross before we do that? We have reached a very, very, very interesting position in the world if what Gaddafi is currently doing imposes on us an obligation towards military intervention. What Gaddafi is doing is shocking, it's morally wrong. The man is a nutcase. But he's also a savage brute who's probably killed 150,000 people in North Africa, as well as aiding terrorist organizations all around the world. But I do not believe that what Gaddafi has done to date justifies us deploying United Nations, NATO troops onto the ground in Libya. Full stop.
And just by the by, do you think you are at one with your party leader on this?
I can't, obviously, see into the head of my party leader or speak on his behalf, but my sense is that what he's come away with is not as David somehow suggests, a massive failure of nerve. What I hope we're trying to regain in this country is a sense of realism. Not a sense of selfish realism, in other words, pragmatic but moral, right? A realism that could be interested, as David Owen is, in the notion of setting up some kind of air supremacy, certainly interested in sanctions, certainly interested in, broadly speaking, making that region, as we have to make it, by any means at our disposal, more prosperous, more stable, more humane in 20 years' time than it is today. But probably, I think, at the moment, a pragmatic realism that does not mean boots on the ground in Tripoli.
Okay, well, assuming for the moment, perhaps you won't want to, David, that that rather broad term coming between, Latin as it may be, does not include, say, coming between the ruler and his people by giving economic aid to protesters, for example.
No, it is. I mean, firstly, Holloway County, we didn't do Latin, and that's not a kind of débat on O point that I'm attempting to make there. It is that the everyday use of the word would mean getting stuck in. It doesn't usually, but I will accept it in this sense. I think that one of the things that was different about the concept of intervention, because there's all kinds of what you would call the projection of soft power, which we haven't talked about, which are important acts. Debt remission, for instance, was one. The Blair government was incredibly active in all kinds of forms of soft power, which were very important. One of the reasons why the government absolutely rightly protects the aid budget in the way in which it does, whilst attempting to try and spend it as intelligently as possible, is because it sees the long-term consequences of the use of aid. And that would be a projection of soft power as well, and a very important one, and the Blair government was very active in that. But specifically on intervention, what it tends to mean is acting against or without the agreement of sovereign governments. That's essentially what it means. It doesn't mean boots on the ground at all. It was certainly an intervention into the affairs of Iraq to operate the no-fly zone in the Kurdish areas, for instance. So John Major did a bit of it, and this was extended under Clinton and Blair to the fly zone and the bombings that took place in pursuit of them in 1998.
Have we intervened in Zimbabwe by imposing sanctions against the wishes of the sovereign government?
Yes, in a way we have intervened. The question about whether you've intervened sufficiently in Zimbabwe, but you can see an argument in the past for not intervening against Zimbabwe, or earlier not intervening at the first signs that the Zimbabwe government were doing things that were wrong. I mean, what becomes the trigger for these things is always very important. So essentially, I would accept intervention not as boots on the ground, but as intervening against the sovereign government. And the question arises, so I wouldn't imagine any scenario, just about, in which British troops set foot in Libya again for the first time since, 1944 or whatever it was, and so on. And we see, the Tommies in Benghazi yet again. But look at the difficulties in getting a no-fly zone agreed. Most people believe, like Paddy Ashton was saying, that a no-fly zone would require UN resolution. You would have to take to the United Nations a resolution for intervention, which would have not to be subject to veto or subject to majority vote by the Security Council. In other words, you would have to attempt to persuade China and Russia simply to set up the procedure that allowed you to prevent, if he were to do so, Gaddafi's jets bombing the insurgents and the rebels in Libya. Now, I put it to you that under the circumstances where, and it may not happen, Gaddafi was able to use his air force to destroy the rebels in that and that process was underway, we would find it very much in our interest to try and intervene. It may be that Rory agrees with that. I simply don't know. There's been a big argument about it.
Yeah. I think if Gaddafi is attempting to conduct some sort of genocidal cleansing of his people, we should be pushing in every way that we can as Britain to impose a no-fly zone on Libya. Yes.
Right. I think I applaud that. A lot of people, including people in your own party, and certainly those without, would regard that as being an example of liberal interventionism, for instance.
Shall we see the audience on this one? How many people...
Can I before we go to this? This is going to not be much of a debate if intervention means any form of foreign policy conducted against any unfriendly regime anywhere in the world. If what we're doing in Burma is intervention, what we're doing in Zimbabwe is intervention, what we're doing in North Korea is intervention, presumably what we're already doing in Libya is intervention, then I don't think we're going to have much disagreement, unless we keep this definition tight so that intervention means what I thought it meant until I turned up tonight. In other words, what we did in Bosnia, what we did in Kosovo, what we did in Sierra Leone, what we did in Iraq, what we did in Afghanistan. We're going to be having a debate about whether or not we should have a foreign policy.
Rory, we didn't put boots on the ground in Kosovo. We simply threatened to.
David, what do you mean we didn't put boots on the ground in Kosovo?
We didn't, not until Milosevic had actually withdrawn.
But that was the point at which the intervention began.
No, that wasn't. The point at which the intervention began was when we bombed Serb assets both in Kosovo and Serbia.
Can we come to some... Before I put that interesting Libya question to you, which I don't want ruled out on the grounds that it's not intervention, but we don't want to rule everything in on the grounds that just saying naughty boy from a place far away is going to be considered intervention. But I do think, Rory, that perhaps you could come halfway and agree that if you are operating a no-fly zone policy, and if it's going to take all the powers of persuasion to get the UN to agree, you're doing something pretty interventionary against a sovereign state.
Well, not really. I mean, in a sense, this is about let the bad guys be, the perils of foreign intervention. The main argument against foreign intervention, the terrible lesson of the last 15 years, is a lesson about what happens when you put troops on the ground. It's a lesson about engagements where we end up getting sucked deeper and deeper in, spending $150 billion a year, putting 150,000 troops on the ground. It's really, just to be coarse about it, it's the lesson of Vietnam. Sure, you can impose a no-fly zone. It's a difficult, complicated thing to do. You need to think seriously about whether you've got the aircraft carriers and the resources. But broadly speaking, as we discovered in the Balkans and in northern Iraq, it's relatively cost-free. It doesn't bring many benefits. It's extremely unlikely to result in regime change.
Why
but it's
are you
not
therefore
very perilous.
in favour of it?
Well, because I think it can contribute. But it's not an intervention. It's not very perilous. And I don't think it's something that anyone in this room thinks is particularly controversial or particularly worth arguing about.
Well, rather than have a semantic discussion, let's have a Libya discussion. Who here would be in favour of pushing our government to push for itself to push for an agreement on a no-fly zone over Libya? Who would like to see that happen? Interestingly few. So I think in that sense, David, your point about...
Ask who wouldn't. Ask who wouldn't.
Very fair point. Who would...
So who would not want a no-fly zone in Libya under any circumstances? Okay, there's your answer.
No, well, let's get this right. Let's get this right, because I want to know...
There are 3 people in the audience who wouldn't want it, so I don't think it's...
Hang on. I'll ask these questions. If there are only 3 people in the audience who would not want a no-fly zone, who the hell were all those people putting their hands up the first time? The question I asked was, would you be in favour of this government lobbying as hard as it can to arrange for...
In the case of ethnic cleansing?
No, I said of Libya. To organise a no-fly zone over Libya. That's a pretty straightforward question, and a large number of people said they would not be in favour of it, of our government doing that. So, say that again, I can't hear.
The opposite. They didn't say they wouldn't be in favour.
Oh, a large... Yes. They said they were in favour. And so who are all the people who haven't put their hands up? What kind of foreign policy are you advocating? I'll ask the question again. Are you broadly in favour of a move towards organising and getting the United Nations to agree to a no-fly zone over Libya, which may well involve taking out some of Gaddafi's air defences? And how... Yes. Okay. Once again, it has to be said, the people who are broadly in favour of that, there's a relatively paltry number, admittedly a better number than the one lone gentleman who said he was against it last time. But then, where's the rest of you? What are the rest of you?
I think I can answer the question, right? Presumably the answer is it depends on the circumstances, right?